Shabbat Shalom. There has been a tumult, even an uproar this week with the leak of a draft Supreme Court ruling that, if carried through, would pave the way to strike down a court decision that's almost 50 years old called Roe v. Wade. And the effect would be that abortion would become illegal in many states, including here in Georgia. And I struggled with whether to address this topic today. And I hesitated for two reasons. One is that there are a lot of teenagers here. Unfortunately, the odds are good that some of the young people in this room may actually come up against this decision, against this question, in a way that those of us who are my age and older will almost certainly not. And some of you who actually remember what it is that I talked about will recall that I spoke about this topic on Rosh Hashanah. Although that was 2021, it's still the same Jewish year, 5782. And so I want to share just a reminder, if you will, of the Jewish ethical view of this divisive issue, but then move on to a particular lens, a particular focus that I think may help us make sense of this conflict that is actually tearing our society apart, and maybe gives insight to where we are in the arc of history in discussion of this topic. So I'll start by saying that the Jewish tradition does not fall neatly into either of the camps that American society has created on this debate. They call themselves pro-life, pro-choice, because American law speaks in terms of rights, the right to life, the right to choose. But Jewish law, Jewish ethics, Jewish values actually come at life in a different way. We speak in terms of obligations. What responsibilities does a woman have for her own well-being versus the responsibilities she might have towards the life growing inside her? What responsibilities does society have to both? Our Jewish answers come from the Torah, from the book of Exodus. There is a case described where a man hits a pregnant woman and causes her to lose her pregnancy. The conclusion is that this is an assault with the concomitant penalties, but it is only murder if there is an ason, if there is a disaster, if the woman herself perishes. And so we learn that abortion is not ethically neutral, but is not murder. And later Jewish sources, considering the question in more depth, conclude that if the fetus is a threat, a risk to the well-being of the mother, then the mother's life takes precedence, is chosen over that of the fetus, even in extreme cases up to the very moment of birth. And so the question for rabbis and sages within the Jewish tradition is one of balance and interpretation. How broadly do you define the well-being of the mother? Is it only if, God forbid, she will die at that moment if the pregnancy is not terminated? What about if there is a medical risk that will only unfold over the course of weeks or months? We can do something now, or we can wait until it's an emergency. To what extent do we consider emotional and psychological damage and distress? And so as you read through the traditional sources in our Jewish legacy, you will see that sages have disagreed about how to balance these parameters, these considerations in the abstract, let alone how to apply them in given situations. The broad Jewish consensus is that abortion has ethical implications. And so, yes, Jewish ethics would argue that though abortion is not murder, it is not always the right choice. And yet at other times, our tradition would not only approve of, but even require the termination of a pregnancy. As a rabbi, I am actually sometimes called upon to consult when a woman and those around her are making such a decision. And I always come to it with a sense of gravity and humility, because my input can only be valuable. My voice is only relevant to the extent that it is based on the experience of the woman and the guidance of medical experts. And I would not presume to second-guess the doctors, and I would not presume to second-guess what is within the heart of a particular woman who might be facing a soul-wrenching choice that I will never have to make for myself. I can talk in theory, but it's not my body or my well-being on the line. And so putting those decisions in the hands of clergy of a different faith, or legislators, or police and prosecutors, will not accomplish a holier or a more moral outcome. I want to turn the conversation in a different direction, because you can read online, I've posted a much more detailed analysis of the issues within halakha, within Jewish law. I want to point out that we are in a particular place in this conversation, in the unfolding of this debate, and there's a particular biblical verse found in this week's Torah portion that I think gives us a window into what makes this conflict so challenging for our society. Leviticus 19:16, Vayikra, Lo telech rachil ba'amecha lo ta'amor al dam re'echa ani Adonai. You shall not be a talebearer amongst your people. Do not stand over the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. This happens a lot in Parashat Kedoshim, where you have 2 or even 3 different concepts in one verse. Honor your father and mother and respect the Sabbath. Respect the Sabbath and honor my sanctuary. And whenever that happens, the rabbis say those commandments, those ideas are somehow being compared, are being thrust against each other because they are not totally in alignment. And often it ends, Ani Adonai, I am the Lord. So you shall not be a talebearer amongst your people. Do not stand over the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. So this has been a very complex debate, wrapped up much more in politics than in ethics. And I want to point out that the way that we got to where we are this week is something that happens very rarely, a leaked draft opinion from the Supreme Court. Now, some of this is because usually no one really wants an advanced look at a 97-page paper on interstate trade. And the question that many are asking is, why did this leak happen? As I signed off of my devices last night, the only information we had as to where this leak came from was very speculative. What is a liberal clerk firing off a warning shot to start protests? Was it a right-winger seeking to force the hand of a justice who might be wavering? Was it someone pursuing an electoral strategy? We may find out, we may not. And I have to point out that this week was May the 4th, Star Wars Day. Wait, it's going to be relevant. Star Wars, the whole thing starts with Darth Vader bursting onto that ship looking for stolen Death Star plans. We had to sit through 11 movies over 40 years before we finally found out who stole the plans for the Death Star. In general, our tradition places a very high value on confidentiality. We have this whole concept of lashon hara, that even if information is true, that you still have an obligation not to share information that might hurt another person. And that's particularly true in the case of Jewish justice. In the tractate Sanhedrin and the Mishnah, we learn that when a judge leaves the courtroom, he may not say, I deemed you exempt and my colleagues deemed you guilty. But what can I do? My colleagues outnumbered me. About this is stated, you shall not go as a talebearer. You shall not spread gossip amongst your people. Our verse, Leviticus 19:16. The Talmud says, the Mishnah says, if the court has ruled, even if the members of the Beit Din disagreed in camera, in their debate, in their deliberations, once they come out, they must be united front. One of the judges can't say, what can I do? I thought you were innocent, but they thought you were guilty. Tough luck. Dissenting opinions don't exist in that understanding of Jewish prudence. Now, of course, in general in Judaism, we love dissent. 3 rabbis, 5 opinions. The Talmud would be a lot shorter if we didn't convey the opinion of every single rabbi who had something to say about every particular topic. The Talmud preserves, cherishes, treasures multiple views on everything. But when you get together to rule on a case where there are real people, real lives involved, then doubt has to be set aside in favor of confidentiality. And in fact, the Talmud, in explicating this law, shares a story that there was a student and there was a rumor that he revealed a statement that was stated in the study hall 22 years later. And Rav Ami ejected him from the study hall. He was expelled as punishment. And Rav Ami said, this is a revealer of secrets and he cannot be trusted. So I find it ironic that he is kicked out for spreading rumors, because there was a rumor that he spread a rumor. But based on this thread of our tradition, leaking would be a very serious, and is a very serious offense. That if information is meant to be confidential, that it cannot, it should not, it must not be shared outside of the walls where it was meant to be revealed. But remember, in Leviticus, when you have 2 halves of a verse, sometimes the 2 halves of the verse don't agree with each other. And the second half says, Lo ta'amor al dam ra'echa, do not stand by the blood of your neighbor. We also have an obligation to not stand idly by. Protecting the health and well-being of another is a positive commandment. And so our tradition says that the one exception to the rules of confidentiality, to the rules even of Lashon Hara, is if someone else is going to be harmed, you have an obligation to tell them that they are walking into trouble. If someone is about to enter into a business deal with Bernie Madoff, you got to whisper in there, this may not be a good idea. Someone is about to sign the contract to buy the Brooklyn Bridge, let them know, the Tri-Borough is a much better deal. If you have information that could cause harm to another, you have an obligation to reveal it. And so, these 2 halves of the verse are in conflict. Protecting the well-being of others versus protecting confidentiality. And in fact, reading that concept out of not standing by the blood of another is actually a wonderful window, an important window into the essence of the debate about abortion in our society in general. Because at least some of those who are arguing against abortion are doing so based on a religious conviction that life begins at conception. I believe that is not true. I believe life begins when your kids finally get their driver's licenses. But those who say that life begins earlier come from other sources in the Bible. In particular, this particular case comes from reading the Bible not in the original Hebrew, but in the Greek translation. So that verse I mentioned a little while ago about the pregnant woman, and there's an assault. If there's an ason, if she dies, then it's murder. Well, in the Greek, ason is translated to mean if there is form to the fetus. So the Greeks translate the verse differently, and the early Christians were reading the Bible not in the original Hebrew, but in, if you'll permit me to quote the father in the Greek wedding movie, in the Greek, and therefore they read it in that way. And so I have to say, an understanding, an appreciation, a respect for those who, even though I think they are reading the Bible wrong, are following it to their best conviction, that they can't stand idly by while human life is taken. And I have to say, if my understanding of the Torah led me to think that abortion was murder, I'd probably be giving a very different sermon this morning. The problem is that it is not just a matter of religious dispute among clergy, rabbis, and ministers. It's become a wedge issue. What should be a sensitive discussion of something that impacts people's very lives has become a political football, has become another way to score points against the other side. And the outcome would be to allow one fundamentalist religious approach to dominate the outlook of an entire society. And that's my second concern. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, you shall not stand over the blood of your neighbor. There is a lot of blood that has the potential to be spilled here. It is the height of cynicism to only care about life until it is actually born. As a society, we are worse at providing essential medical care, support for food and shelter, affordable childcare so that parents can go and work and support themselves than almost any other developed nation. Our infant mortality rate is worse than Slovenia and Cuba. If you want to look at countries that are as good as we are at preventing maternal death, at ensuring that women survive the process of birth, we are in good company. We are right up there with Tajikistan. And that's the flip side of lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. In a world where there are not legal paths to terminate pregnancy when it is called for, a lot of other blood is going to be spilled. A lot of women facing dangerous pregnancies, pregnancies that cannot, under any circumstances, no matter what we do, bear a viable child. Victims of rape will be at much greater risk. The verse, lo telech rachel, do not be a talebearer. One of the things that concerns me about some of the legislation that's coming out is that it enlists private citizens or corporate America to hunt down pregnant women and anyone who helps them. And look, almost none of this is about me, right? Although you might think otherwise if you see me from the side. And yet, some of these laws could actually come back even to rabbis and physicians, because if I counsel a woman or a couple that termination of pregnancy is the proper course, as I sometimes do, I could be legally liable. Some Yahoo in Mississippi could sue me. For others, there's a much more realistic fear. In many places, women are going to be afraid to use health trackers, lest that information be subpoenaed. About 1/3 of all pregnancies end in natural miscarriage, and I spend so much time talking with couples who have felt that distress of having their hopes of having a healthy child and having those hopes taken from them. Imagine if the sadness of that loss is compounded as that miscarriage is not just a medical emergency, but also a potential crime investigation. I believe that God created all things with purpose. Now, I don't always know what that purpose is. That's above my pay grade. But I can only gather that it is not the purpose of every pregnancy to come to term. It is not the purpose of every fetus to breathe and walk. Our Jewish tradition tells us that fetal life has value and meaning, as anyone who has ever lost a pregnancy can tell you. But at the same time, it does not have the same value, it does not have the same worth as the lives of men and women who take breath and walk the earth. And by the way, these laws can lead to surprising outcomes beyond what you might expect. So for example, one area of focus in our Jewish community is fertility treatments. Couple who want to have a child and go through IVF, in vitro fertilization. And often in IVF, multiple embryos have to be implanted so that at least one will make it. But often what will happen is that several will be implanted, but that one or two will need to be culled because quadruplets, triplets have a very low chance of survival. So you leave the stronger ones and you take the ones that might be a risk to the others. Pregnancy reduction. And that would become illegal in much of the country, in half the country, if this law were to pass. Women who are seeking to have children will be thwarted. So it remains to be seen how this conflict will play out. After all, the ruling that was leaked is only a draft. I don't know how the wheels of justice and politics will turn. But I turn back to this verse. Lo telech rachil, lo tamor adam re'echa ani Adonai. Don't be a talebearer. Don't stand by the blood of your neighbor. I am God. Don't be a talebearer. Don't stand by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. Don't be a talebearer. We have an obligation to allow for privacy in this world. Lo ta'almod al dam re'echa. We have an obligation to protect the blood of others. We have an obligation to protect life, but the lives of the born always take precedence of the lives of those who are not born. And finally, I am the Lord. The verse ends by telling us that God is God and we are not. We cannot stand in God's place to sit in judgment over others, over terrible choices that they face. We remember that ultimate justice rests only in heaven. We're just trying our best. And ultimately, God stands in judgment over our actions. And as a citizen, as a proud citizen of the United States, I understand that the Constitution is a source of our rights. But as a religious person, I believe that God is the source of what is right. As this debate unfolds in our society, I cannot stand in God's place. I refuse to do it, and I refuse to allow others to do it in my name. It is my job to ensure that God's word is heard and not claimed exclusively by those who have not read it in the original. Shabbat Shalom.